All right, thanks, Jeff. I really appreciate it. It was a nice introduction. Well, good morning, everybody. Thanks for coming out on your Sunday morning. It's quite the crowd. I really appreciate it. I want to thank Judy for the invitation and coordinating my time here. I also want to thank Fred Merrill. I don't know if he's in the crowd. I met Fred last December at the Saddle Club with some friends. We got to talking. And we touched on my service in the Army and on 9/11 in the White House. He said, "Hey, great topic. I got a couple groups that I think you want to come talk to." And great. Talked to Rotary East. Talked to Sons in Retirement earlier in the year. Really enjoyed doing that. Judy got my name through Fred, and here I am. So I really appreciate the chance to come here and talk to you all. So as my introduction through Jeff said, I was senior duty officer in the White House Situation Room on September 11, 2001. I think most of you are pretty well versed what happened on September 11th, how it changed our lives, how it changed our government. I think some of us probably spent some time learning more about that day. So I have a few recollections that I'd like to share with you that hopefully you'll find interesting. So let me start with just a little bit of background. President Kennedy established the Situation Room in 1961 after the failed Bay of Pigs invasion. One of the things that he observed was that needed to better coordinate information and intelligence across government, and he needed to have it close to him. So he established the Situation Room. Situation Room is in the West Wing of the White House. We'll talk a little bit more about that in a moment. So let me talk about the White House complex itself. Many of you have been to Washington, D.C. You know where the White House is, pretty much center of the city of near the National Mall. It's an 18-acre complex. It's got the White House in the middle with the residence. It has an East Wing, which is a ceremonial wing. It has the West Wing, which we all know about, which is Office of the President, the Oval Office, as well as senior officials, whether it be the National Security Advisor, the White House Counsel, Chief of Staff, as well as the Situation Room. Some of you may have read or may have heard on the news that the Situation Room is this intricate complex, bunker complex. It's not. It's on the ground floor of the West Wing. When you walk in through the entrance to the West Wing off West Executive Avenue, you walk in to the right, Situation Room, right next to the White House mess. It's on the ground level. So it's not this big underground complex. So how is the Situation Room staffed? What does the Situation Room entail? We'll talk a little bit about that. Let's talk about the people that staff the Situation Room. So the Situation Room is part of the larger National Security Council staff. The National Security Council staff is staffed by people that come from other departments and agencies across government, including the military services. Serve as a detailee, they're called, for 2 to 3 years, working for the President and the National Security Advisor. Situation Room, as part of the National Security Council staff, is staffed that way. I was the Army representative in the Situation Room. Each of the military services is represented. We had an Army rep, Navy rep, Air Force, and Coast Guard, and a Marine Corps. Even though it's not its own service, it had a Marine Corps also had a rep. So how did I get selected to be the Army representative in the Situation Room? Usually look for a field grade officer. I was a major at the time, senior captain, then a major. They recruit out of a program that I attended called the Postgraduate Intelligence Program. It's at the National Intelligence University at Bolling Air Force Base, just on the other side of the Anacostia from downtown DC. The Army nominated a group of us. We interviewed with the Army, we interviewed with the intelligence community, and we interviewed with the White House for the position. I lucked out, and I was the Army rep soon after my final interview. Also of note, most National Security Council positions, including those in the White House, are non-political positions. They are not political appointees. As I mentioned, served for 2 to 3 years. I served initially at the last half of the Clinton administration and then transitioned into the Bush administration. So we're not tied to an administration politically. So what's the mission of the Situation Room? It's pretty simple. It's keep the president and the National Security Advisor informed of fast-breaking events across the globe and in the United States. It's interesting in how that information is coordinated. And it's coordinated just information and intelligence, and there's a difference. Intelligence is information that's been analyzed. Someone sits down and says, what does this information mean? It becomes intelligence, an intelligence report, classification, etc. Situation Room deals in facts, does not do its own analysis. We get intelligence reports and information from other departments and agencies, and we determine several things with that. Who needs to see it? How quickly do they need to see it, and how are we going to get that to them? And them usually means the president or the National Security Advisor, or both. And we do that ways that you could imagine. We do that with written reports. We do that via email, that via phone, and we do that face-to-face. Our main person, go-to person for an event would be the National Security Advisor. Occasionally, we would have to brief the president face-to-face, but usually we'd go through the National Security Advisor. So one thing of note, when we talk about hard copy sharing of information and intelligence, the Situation Room, and as a senior duty officer, we were responsible for producing a one-page summary for the president and the National Security Advisor in every 12-hour period. So Situation was set up to operate 24/7, 12-hour shift during the day, 12-hour shift during the night, led by a senior duty officer and a team that usually would be 3, 4, 5 people, depending on what was going on, and we could bring people in to augment for crises also. The one-page summary is an interesting summary. I think you may have heard of the presidential daily briefing that he gets every day from the Director of National Intelligence and a contingent from the Central Intelligence Agency. That's where the president does get some analysis from those folks. The summary the Situation Room produces goes in the president's read book, and he reads it when he sits down and reads his read book various times during the day. And again, it's fact-based reporting. We choose the information that goes into the summary. It can only be one page. We receive from the National Security Advisor, when I would come on duty, maybe a half a dozen different priorities that she would. Dr. Connie Rice was the National Security Advisor on the second half of my tour, and would say these 6 priorities, and we would focus on those during our 12-hour shift. And the summary would reflect those priorities. So for example, an event happens in country A, we see it on the TV. Not only would we take that piece of information that we received off media, the television, but we rarely would ever just take that media report and go to the National Security Advisor or the president and say, this is what's happening. We'd always have to layer that with different perspectives from across government. So if it was country A, something happened, we see that on the news, we'd always reach out to the State Department. What's the embassy saying? We look at the different types of intelligence, whether it's human intelligence from the CIA, signals intelligence from the National Security Agency. We reach out to the Pentagon, to the National Military Command Center, and we try to build a layered perspective to compare and contrast what's out there being reported. So it was a really unique document. Again, only one page long, so being brief was very important. And that would be disseminated to the president. We managed a whole bunch of different read books: Vice President, National Security Advisor, Chief of Staff, Counsel, Communications Director. So a lot of people were fed this summary, and then we back that summary up with other reports whether it's just regular information or intelligence reports that would go along to the read books. We will also communicate via email. We had a dissemination system that we'd use, was very quick to get it out to the appropriate National Security Council directorates, whether it was a country directorate or area of expertise like counterterrorism. So the Situation Room itself organized really three components: the watch floor, which the senior duty officer would manage with your team, workstations, as you can imagine, computer screens, TVs on the wall, and that's where the work gets done in the Situation Room. There was also a conference facility. We had three highly secure conference rooms the president would use on a daily basis, as well as the National Security Advisor and the National Security Advisor staff. We also had a communications element that was highly secure and highly, 20 years ago, it was high tech. You can only imagine what it's like now with, with all the capability we have today. But that was manned by some very experienced technicians from the military services that a lot of them would spend their whole career working in the Situation Room as part of the White House Military Office. Is that technical and that much to learn about not only the Situation Room and the communications, but they would also go with the president when he traveled. Another interesting thing that we would do to manage communication in the Situation Room were head of state phone calls. Head of state phone calls could be routine, planned in months in advance, or they could be in crisis. Like I'll talk a little bit more on 9/11. Head of state phone calls happen frequently. One of those things that you really have to get used to doing, nothing, at least when I was at the White House, was ever recorded. And everything when it came to head of state phone calls, we would listen to and we would take notes. Probably half a dozen of us would listen to the call. We take our notes, put them together at the end, and we produce a memorandum of record about the head of state phone call. You can go online and do presidential head of state phone calls. There's some that have been declassified that are online. It was remarkable when you put these notes together, how accurate that final memorandum actually was. People were pretty good at doing it. And then before we get into some specifics about 9/11, I would always try to remember and pinch myself that there was never such thing as a routine day. And if I walked in down West Executive Boulevard through the Secret Service gate, and I thought I was just going into another day at the office, I would always stop, kind of look around, look at where you are. There's nothing routine about this. And so I tried to do that every day and realized that every day was part of history and every day was part of the presidential record, which I think we all know is important. It's important to get things right. And 9/11 was an example of how important getting things right actually was. So let's quickly do a scene setter of what happened on 9/11. So at 8:46 on September 11, 2001, the first plane hit World Trade Center number 1. At 9:03, the second plane hit World Trade Center number 2. And then the third plane hit the Pentagon at 9:37. So where was everybody? So if you remember, President Bush was traveling in Florida. He was in an elementary school reading to a class of elementary school kids. Vice President Cheney and the National Security Advisor, Dr. Condoleezza Rice, were in the White House complex. They were in their offices. When the first plane hit, knew things were, it was a crisis, but not sure of all the details. When the second plane hit, that was enough to where National Security Advisor and Vice President were moved to a secure area. We could still communicate with them. And we were also communicating with our director, the White House Situation Room director, a Navy admiral. Her name is Deborah Lower. She was traveling with the president, And Andy Card, the chief of staff, was also traveling with the president. So the Situation Room is in touch with Admiral Lower, giving her the details of the attacks. And when the second plane hit the World Trade Center Tower number 2, I think many of you are familiar with the video and the photo of Andy Card. Admiral Lower tells Andy Card about the second plane. He walks onto the stage into the classroom and whispers into the president's ear. The second plane has hit the World Trade Center. America's under attack. So where was I? So my wife, Bonnie, and I lived downtown DC. We lived about a mile from the Situation Room in the White House complex. So I'd been in late the day before. I was planning on coming in later in the day on 9/11. Obviously, that changed my schedule. So I was able to get ready. We lived right next door to a metro stop. The metro at this time was still running. It closed down later. I was able to ride to my normal spot, Vermont Avenue Station, just north of the White House complex. Got out there, and at this point, the Secret Service had pushed the perimeter of the White House complex across Lafayette Square. I don't know if you're familiar with Lafayette Square. It's on the north side of the White House complex, well out to all the way to the metro stop. And they did that on each side of the White House complex. They pushed all the way out to Constitution Avenue across the ellipse, and same with the east and west. So when I got off, I walk into a heavily armed Secret Service guy, and I tell him who I am and what I needed to do. And he said, all right. He said, move in a straight line across Lafayette Square. Don't run. Walk briskly and hold your credentials above your head. And so, I'm walking briskly across Lafayette Square, and I'm getting why he was telling me to do that. There, Secret Service arrayed on top of the residence. They were arrayed on the old executive office building to the west, and as well as Treasury Department to the east, and hundreds on the ground. I don't know where they all came from, but they were there. So I arrived in the Situation Room when the coordination, the airspace above the United States had already been shut down. I had moved to my desk. Secretary of Transportation Norman Mineta, who from San Jose, many of you probably know of him, was at my desk working with a very senior DoD representative in grounding aircraft. They're having some challenges with that. There were still some unidentified aircraft in the air, and so they were actively coordinating that through NORAD and the Pentagon. NORAD, as you know, runs the radar, the air defense of North America. They were also scrambling fighter jets. DoD representative was scrambling fighter jets to protect New York City, protect Washington, D.C., as well as protect Air Force One. President this time was in the air, was not going to return immediately to D.C., did that later in the night, and they were determining where they were actually going to fly to. Shortly after 10 o'clock is when the fourth plane crashed in Shanksville, Pennsylvania. Lots of thoughts about where that plane might have been heading, thanks to the heroics of the passengers. It crashed. Some people are speculating maybe the White House or maybe the Capitol. And even after the fourth plane crashing, there were still some unidentified aircraft in the air. So let's talk real quick about some of the challenges. 20 plus years ago, the civilian global satellite network and how it sent out information, how quickly it could send out information was fairly new. This is one of the largest media events up to that time. Instant worldwide reaction to the attacks. Force Situation Room, responsible for coordinating information and intelligence. You can only imagine how busy it was. And with just a hyper sense of we have all this information. How do we pare it down to something that senior leadership, president and senior leadership could use? So we're talking to senior White House officials. We're talking to federal, state, and local officials and their staffs, world leaders, and the media. So using a military term, the Situation Room was the center of gravity for this web of communication. So you had Situation Room, you had Air Force One, President's still in the plane, he still has requirements, heads of state, federal, state, local leaders, obviously close communications with the city of New York, Pennsylvania, and Virginia. Pentagon's in Virginia. Actually, for those of you know, it's on the other side of the Potomac. And the Pentagon doesn't have a fire department. So the city of Arlington is the Pentagon's fire department. And so the incident commander is actually the fire chief from Arlington, Virginia, until some more senior people arrived on scene at the Pentagon. So we're talking to a lot of folks, as well as the internal White House officials. One of the constant things, at least I remember, that we constantly had to think about is, what does the president need? What information and intelligence requirements did the president need? And that wasn't like, well, we'll just state it right after the attacks and it stayed that way the whole day. It constantly changed. There were constantly questions coming in, constantly directives from the vice president, from the national security advisor, from Air Force One. So it was something that we had to focus on. I know I focused on. And there was also another senior duty officer in the Situation Room that was there when the attacks first happened. And so we worked in tandem, and that was one of the things that we had to focus on. And not only what his requirements were, but who did he need to convey that information and that intelligence to. So that was another kind of racking and stacking his schedule to talk to different people, because it was constant. And I don't want it to sound like the Situation Room is the White House switchboard. It's not. It's just that day we were just communicating via phone with so many people globally. It felt like we were the White House switchboard. We learned a lot about federal department and agency communications. I mentioned a few. I talked to the Pentagon and the National Military Command Center half a dozen times a day on just a regular day. So that's a big operation. State Department Operations Center, big operation. FBI has pretty sophisticated 24/7 capability, but it was enlightening that that's not true across government. At least it wasn't true on September 11th. I think now we see a big change in comparison. For example, the Department of Transportation. You imagine the FAA has a pretty robust capability in its operations center, but the department itself did not. That was one reason Secretary of Transportation Mineta was in the Situation Room, because we did have the capability to where he could get this crisis. He could be involved in the crisis and had communications whomever he needed to speak to. One of the requirements that early on had to evolve very quickly, and that was attribution. Who attacked us? That was one of the immediate requirements that we had after assessing what happened in casualties and damage and things like that. Attribution was a big topic. So I mentioned that the National Security Council is organized into country directorates as well as areas of expertise like counterterrorism. So counterterrorism has a standing committee called an interagency committee made up of federal departments and agencies representatives that would meet routinely, talk about counterterrorism policy. So on 9/11, its director, a gentleman named Richard Clark, some of you may know of him. He's been on the news over the years and has written quite a bit now about cyber. He was the director of the committee. So he started calling people in that he could get in touch with, so the committee could stand up in one of the conference rooms at the Situation Rooms to initially work on attribution. They did that for quite a while. Another thing that was really important, and I mentioned the historical record, the presidential record, was just keeping a log of what was going on. As a senior duty officer, I was responsible for the logs, pretty easy to do routinely. On a moderate crisis day, we were busy, we were pretty well versed, but on a day like 9/11, it was really crazy. But we had a good sense of what we were there for, a sense of the record, presidential record, historical record. And so that was something that both of us, senior duty officers, tried to manage very closely. And I think we did a pretty good job afterwards. And looking back, the logs proved to be really, really helpful. Heads of state phone calls were happening by the minute. I don't remember how many we did, but none of the requirements that I talked about before when it came to the memorandums of record still needed to be written. And so that was a big job after things slowed down a little bit, but we did just a slew of head of state phone calls. We also treated calls with officials in New York, Pennsylvania, and Virginia as head of state phone calls. So we did a record for all those calls also. So during this period of uncertainty with unknown aircraft still flying, the decision was made by the Secret Service to evacuate the White House. White House had never been evacuated before, never in its history. And I guess it's okay to say now, because I'm sure this has been fixed, there wasn't an evacuation plan. And I was read on to all kinds of evacuation plans, but I wasn't read into evacuating the White House. And it was interesting because the Secret Service was doing the evacuation, telling people to leave. They were really good at keeping people out. There was no real plan on getting people out in an orderly fashion. People did leave, and they left in a hurry. One story of a staff member on the vice president's staff. The vice president's staff was in the old executive office building. She came into the situation room, and the vice president wanted a rep in the situation room. So she told the story of how a Secret Service agent had just came into their space and was yelling, "Evacuate now. Ladies, drop your heels and run." So that's the kind of evacuation it was. It was interesting talking to folks afterwards. They were able to leave the White House complex, but DC was shutting down and they couldn't drive. And so people were kind of standing around out by the ellipse where most people parked, wondering what to do. Some people were able to walk home, but others had to wait until people figured out how they were going to get them home. So the situation room did not evacuate. And I'm really proud of the story, proud of the team. That Secret Service came in soon after the vice president's rep came in. And the guy who came in wasn't yelling to evacuate, just let everyone know that the complex was being evacuated. And if you were going to leave, leave now. And we all kind of, the situation room isn't really a very big place, especially on the watch floor. So we all kind of looked around at each other, phone's still ringing off the hook, people are talking, and just knew that we had to stay. And so we did. There's about 25 of us that stayed. And one of the senior directors from the National Security Council staff got a clipboard, passed that around the situation room. We all put our names on the clipboard, and then the clipboard was given to our deputy director, who was a civilian, a guy named Ralph Sigler. Ralph took the names, typed them into an email, and then sent that out to other departments and agencies. Why? Because we didn't know if we were going to get attacked. We didn't know if a plane was going to come hit the White House. So we wanted to have a list out in the federal government so people knew who was there. after 9/11, probably a week after, when we were able to sit down and kind of talk about what happened and maybe make some observations and findings, we talked about that list and we named it the dead list. We told Admiral Lower aboard Air Force One what we did. She did the same thing with all souls aboard Air Force One. So pretty sober moment when that email went out. Another interesting topic was presidential succession. When you come on board the Situation Room, it's a fire hose of things you need to know, and you do talk about the presidential succession list. But on 9/11, the deputy director, Ralph Sigler, he had been in the Situation Room for over 35 years. He started off as one of those communications technicians and worked his way up. He was in the Situation Room when President Reagan was shot in 1980, and he very well remembered the press conference that Secretary of State Al Haig, retired Army general, held, and he was asked about, well, the president's in the hospital, who's in charge? And he said, well, I am. I don't know if any of you remember that. Well, that wasn't correct. And there's lots of things that boiled up because of that statement. And so Ralph wanted to make sure that no one in the Situation Room made that mistake. And so he kind of sat us down and we talked about really the first five: Vice President, Speaker of the House, President Pro Tem, Senate, Secretary of State, Secretary of Treasury. So knowing that was just only one piece of it. We needed to know in the Situation Room who these people were and where were they. The attacks happened at the beginning of the day, so DC is a pretty early place to start work. So most were already in their offices, some were traveling, but it was just another thing that we had to do that day in crisis. So that was also pretty sobering, talking about presidential succession. And throughout the day, there was still the threat of an attack. Maybe not a hijacked aircraft, but there was lots of talk about maybe a chemical attack, maybe a biological attack, maybe radiological, some kind of improvised explosive device or IED. A lot of things were swirling out there in the threat stream. A couple of things I look back now and I think it's kind of funny. Not so much during the day. We had two huge boxes delivered into the West Wing. One of the staff went out to take a look at what's inside the boxes and came back and said, it's a bunch of Army gear. And I'm the Army guy, right? So I go out there to take a look at it, and it's chemical protective suits and chemical protective masks. And it's like, wow, okay. Probably a little late. Maybe we could have had these when we had time to actually teach people, how to use them. But okay, the thought was there, right? We went back to work. A little while later, we saw on West Executive Avenue, just outside the Situation Room. Situation Room does have windows. You can see out, you just can't see in. And this big pallet is trucked in, and next thing we know, we see all these Secret Service agents taking this pallet apart, pulling off these big crates, opening them up, and they're Stinger missiles. And so they had about 100 Stinger missiles. They went out, deployed, shoulder fired around the White House complex. Probably some of those guys on top of the residence were stocked up for sure. So just touch base one more time because it's important, especially when I think back about what we did, is that everything's part of the historical record. Constantly telling the team, everything you write, both electronically and in hard copy, everything's going to be collected at the end, and everything's going to get subpoenaed. And sure enough, that's what happened. We're all familiar with the White House 9/11 committee, or I'm sorry, the House Representatives 9/11 committee did a pretty extensive report got a lot of that information. And the White House staff afterwards, the Situation Room staff, worked closely with the 9/11 committee on looking at those logs of events, commenting on those logs of events, commenting on things that occurred, had state phone calls, et cetera, especially about what we knew prior. We also chuckled afterwards too, that wonder how many books people were going to write that were here, with us that day. And there's several out there. In fact, I just heard that George Stephanopoulos is going to write a history of the Situation Room. His staff had been reaching out to many folks to ask questions for that history. And some of you also may have read that the Situation Room just went through a $50 million renovation. So I can only imagine what it's like now. I thought it was pretty cool 20 years ago. So in retrospect, when I look back on that day, I'm just really proud of the folks that I had the pleasure to serve with, in that crisis. How solid they were, how mission focused they were in crisis. And it really was. And it stayed that way for not only 9/11, but for many days after the attacks. So what are my takeaways? The few takeaways. The amazing capability of our government. Not only its capabilities, but its expertise, its commitment, and its global reach. Being able to, that one small space, being able to contact anybody on the globe within reason, but any place on the globe very, very quickly. It takes a lot of expertise and technical capability to do that. As a political science major, I always thought I understood federalism, and I did, theoretically. An event like 9/11 really was a good classroom on federalism, especially in disaster response, and understanding that local and state jurisdictions are in charge. Federal government's not, for the most part. President Bush understood that as a governor. He made sure that city of New York, the mayor and the fire chief, who was the incident commander, he personally let them know that every capability within the U.S. government is at your disposal, and he let everyone know that. It was just for an Army officer who's used to just dealing in my own little world, and now on the White House stage. Seeing federalism in action like that was a really good learning point, and it really focused me. In my last takeaway here, I think my introduction mentioned this was my final assignment. I retired the year after 9/11, and went to work in the Pentagon, where I was for another 15 years. And what I chose to focus on was the Department of Defense's role domestically. It soon became clear to me that a lot of my friends and colleagues from the Army were going to Afghanistan. We're going to be wrapped up somehow, especially with special forces background, in the counterterrorism mission that's still ongoing today. And I realized what a niche it would be to understand how the Department of Defense operated domestically. So I did that for many years at the Pentagon. So let me just wrap it up real quick with just the statement that it was a privilege and honor to serve. I appreciate you listening to the story. I have a lot of pleasure being able to speak to people about that day. There was a long period, 10 years after 9/11, that we weren't able to speak about it. So it's only been in the last 10 years, 12 years, to talk about some of the specifics that happened that day. So thank you very much. I appreciate your time, and I'm here for questions. My pleasure.
He'll come on. I bet some of you might have some questions. Okay, so do you have one over there, George?
Did you have an actual incident commander designated?
Where's the microphone? Oh, I'm sorry. For those who are familiar with the incident command system, we weren't organized that way, but there certainly were folks in charge. I mentioned the name Frank Miller. He's the senior director on the National Security Council staff. That he was kind of the de facto guy in the situation room. If they needed if it wasn't a senior duty officer, he would handle if there was some major policy that needed to be discussed or actions that needed to be discussed. He was kind of the clearinghouse. But we had direct, immediate communication with Dr. Rice, as well as the vice president, and as well as the president on Air Force One. But as far as an incident commander, I would say it was Frank Miller in the situation room, as well as myself as a senior duty officer and the other duty officer that was on board.
So when I was watching the TV that morning, after the second plane hit, shortly after that, I saw 3 missiles that were deployed and sent off, and nobody talked about it for a long time. And then years later, I found out. Do you know where those were sent? As they're trying to figure out who was attacking us.
So 3 missiles. Do you have any more? I don't know about that. So I don't. Where are these missiles? Do you have an idea? This is in New York City. No, I'm not familiar with that.
And you think that, well, we've sent those off now.
We had communication with all of the combat aircraft, U.S. aircraft that were flying above New York City, Washington, D.C. with Air Force One. I can say with certainty there were no other aircraft up in the sky. And I'm not aware of a U.S. aircraft firing missiles or from the ground. Yeah, no, I'm not familiar with that, but thanks for sharing it.
Hi, hello, hi. Thank you so much for the presentation. I've been around a long time, and I was here when at Parkland when Kennedy was brought in and was shot, and everybody was looking the other way when that happened. And people who were training to do that, nobody sort of paid attention to that. And then, now with 9/11, people that were trained, the pilots were training at Embry-Riddle, learning how to fly those aircraft, not how to take off and land, but just how to fly the aircraft. And nobody was looking at that. How is security now as far as people training, foreign nationals training at our facilities, and how to do these various things that might seem suspicious?
So I appreciate your question, and certainly, as someone who has looked at all the different things that led up to what happened that day, that certainly is something that jumps out. I will tell you, as senior duty officer in the Situation Room, I didn't have much visibility of that, and so I know people looked at that. I know that my role in the Department of Defense post 9/11 over 15 years, working with the Department of Homeland Security, that I think it's scrutinized really well, or it's scrutinized by many departments and agencies, and who's getting training. But like anything in government, you'd like to think that we put a lot of personnel and resources towards it, that it's going to get fixed. Pretty sure that has been addressed. Probably not perfect. And when you look at the 9/11 report from the House, it says there was a lack of imagination leading up to the event. I don't know about that. They were certainly creative, but I would like to think that there's responsible people out there. They're taking care of that loophole, but it just goes to show, what else could someone else think of? It might not be normal. Oh, there's another over here.
Yes, thank you. So you're probably aware that a third building at the World Trade Center was destroyed on 9/11. And building number 7 was a 52-story high-rise, huge building that came down at 5:20 p.m., not in the morning after 5 o'clock. And it was not hit by a plane. So the theory that, it came down because of fires caused by a plane, doesn't apply to building number 7. But also it collapsed symmetrically into its own footprint in only 11 seconds. And afterwards, they found thermite in the debris surrounding it. So there's only one possible explanation for what caused the collapse of building number 7. And so I wonder if you would comment on that.
I can't. It's like the missile situation happened. I did not have visibility of it. And I don't know about that building specifically that you're speaking to. I know there was significant damage caused by the towers collapsing, but I don't know about that. I wish I could offer you a little bit more. Sorry, I can't.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for the presentation today. 2 fast questions. What was your rank that you attended in those meetings? Were you major, colonel?
I was a major.
Major, okay.
Mhm.
How often does the Situation Room meet? Is it daily, 7 days a week, or is it called for special occasions?
No, so situation is staffed 24/7, two separate shifts, 12 hours during the day, 12 hours at night. It can ramp up depending on what's happening. As far as more people, there's always some teams that are in reserve that can be called in. As a senior duty officer, I got called in all the time on my time off to augment a team. And as I mentioned, staff, not only on the National Security Council as a whole, but in the Situation Room, are detailees from other departments and agencies. So there's always the capability to pull people even in from outside departments and agencies to come in and staff in crisis, or even routinely for sometimes we have projects that might be going on for an extended period that we need more people. But teams are pretty well practiced for, I'll call them routine crises. So usually the 5-person team plus communication support and the rest of the NSC staff was usually enough to manage most crises that we did. 9/11 certainly an exception.
Hi. I'm sure analysis was done afterwards about what worked, what didn't work in the Situation Room that day. Can you talk a little bit about what changes were made after 9/11?
Sure. Evacuation plan. An evacuation plan, that was what it didn't affect us directly since we didn't evacuate. Certainly of all the standard operating procedures and protocols and other things that we had to be well versed in, evacuation wasn't part of that. So evacuation, also we didn't have an alternate site that would have been helpful. We had an alternate site, but it wouldn't have been helpful. It needed some TLC, needed some money, and that has certainly been rectified. We also relied a lot on the Department of Defense for alternate capability, but when planes struck the Pentagon, so they had their own issues. So we learned we were kind of out on our own for redundancy. So I'd say evacuation, alternate location. I think the folks that I worked with that day understood what was going on, understood what they needed to do. I think, like with most crises, it would have been we could have slowed everything down a little bit. That would have been helpful, but you can't, right? So what can you do to kind of mitigate how fast things are moving? Often, people think that it's more people. I'm not quite sure. I think we walked away from that saying we did the best we could. I'm not sure we do that much different other than the first two things that I mentioned. Some training maybe with chemical, biological, radiological protective gear. You know, that was a takeaway. Also, when it came to individual training. So those are the two that pop out at me.
Right here. Further on evacuation, interesting how things come together like this. I'm assuming that they've really developed an evacuation plan so that people who leave the safety of the building aren't standing around in the parking lot trying to figure out how to get home.
Right.
Can you
Yes.
talk a little more about that?
So we found when we started, so I left before that plan was finished. We knew that it didn't work well, came up with some stopgap things to make sure that, yeah, people weren't just hanging around out in the parking lot. And found that, like anything in DC, there's a lot of people who are involved in conversation. So you think about, like I mentioned, what was the problem? Why were people standing around? Well, all the roads were closed. They weren't letting people out. They had the National Guard blocking, the bridges across the Potomac, across the Anacostia, roads blocked off going north into Maryland. And so it was just kind of paralyzed. I know what happened after was that we needed a little bit more of a coordinated response here with the Council of Government, with agencies that come together to talk about these things, keep some routes open so people can get out. And so I know there's been a lot of work doing that, and being a DC downtown resident, even in the local, as a citizen of the city, evacuations routes were started to come on board. This will be open. You can leave this way. So I think there's a lot of work done on getting people to maybe a little safer environment. I know a lot of it, and this probably wouldn't have been helpful if another aircraft would have crashed into the White House complex, but a lot of the facilities have been hardened a lot more than they were prior to 9/11.
Yes, thanks for being here. Are you familiar with Site R, which is about an hour from DC?
Yes.
Okay. The reason I ask is because I grew up near there at Fort Ritchie, Maryland, the military base. So we have Site R 5 miles from there, and Camp David 5 miles on the other side. During the Cold War, that was purposed for evacuation of the president, to my knowledge, to allow them to continue to function in case of a nuclear war. So that's a very bunkered, well-fortified mountain in Pennsylvania. So I'm wondering what happened where a president is flying around in airspace in a very vulnerable position, as opposed to possibly being transported to an area like that, like Site R.
Right. So I'm not dodging your question. As a former intelligence officer, there's things I can talk about and things I can't. So, everyone, you can look up Site R online. I can't talk about anything more than, yes, I know about Site R. All right. But let me address the other part of what you're saying, because I think that is important, because I didn't really touch on it. So President wasn't just flying around all day. I think many of you know that they took him to Offutt Air Force Base, which is the home of Strategic Air Command. That is the military command that manages a nuclear response. So they're set up with hardened facilities. I think if you go online and look at news reporting, you'll see that the president went to Offutt Air Force Base. That's where they determined they were going to take him. They had underground facilities, conference facilities that he was able to use. And so we communicated with a security backbone or a communications backbone that met his needs. So we were able to communicate with him there really well. until it was still, he finally just said, I'm going back to DC. So then he got on Air Force One and came back to DC, but he did stop at Offutt for several hours, not side R.
Thank you so much for superb talk, and thank you
Thanks.
so much for all you've done in safeguarding us in our country. My question is, how much did you have to deal with speculation, rumors, false information coming out right away? As I recall, not just in the media, but I'm sure from other sources and perhaps even by other enemies of ours.
So a couple of things, thoughts on that. So leading up to 9/11, there was lots of chatter. We call it chatter in the intelligence community of things that could happen. Situation room, as I mentioned, we dealt in fact. We didn't do our own analysis. We managed the analysis other departments and agencies were doing, and we disseminate that appropriately. As far as when it happened, I'm looking for the right word. So there's lots of information out there that we had to try to coordinate and manage the best we could. And just as I mentioned, the volume that you had to sort through, again, I need to report fact. I don't need to report speculation. I don't need to, share some analysis that isn't coming from a source that I know and is kind of certified, right? So there may be some people that have some thoughts about who may have done it, what some of the specifics were. My duty was to make sure the president and national security advisor and staff were getting fact-based reporting. And as I mentioned, even just routinely in our daily summary, you may have one nugget of information, but I'm not going to the president with one little piece of information. I'm going to make sure that I back that up with other sources, other methods, and layer any piece that comes out of the situation and goes to him or the national security advisor or the rest of the staff. So it was really hard to do. And, requirements, as I mentioned, constantly changed, constantly shifted throughout the day. And someone had to pay attention to that and make sure that, what we were sending was fact-based.
Thank you very much. You mentioned early on about heads of state phone calls, and they're not recorded, and several people listen and compare notes and things. I wondered what else you could tell us about that. It's something I've often imagined. What's it like, if Mr. Putin calls Mr. Biden or vice versa, and did the other side not record anything? What's the general? There must be translators quite often.
Right.
What is all that like?
So routine heads of state phone calls in crisis, kind of different animals. There's still the same requirement to make sure that there's a record of what was said in the call. It's a skill, and it's one of those things that you don't really get good at till you've been there for a while. And so let me see if I can give you a little bit more detail. If we had a head of state phone call, 4 out of the 5 people on my team would have headsets on. They'd be sitting at their computer listening to the call, and they'd be typing out what they heard. And so it doesn't look pretty when you have 4 different people typing this stuff out, trying to merge them together. And then, you get a couple National Security Council staffers bring their notes over, and you get somebody from the State Department who emails their notes in. So it's quite the production as a senior unit officer, putting those together into something for the presidential record. Lots of coordination. Even in crisis, many heads of state aren't going to speak English. They're going to speak their native tongue. So if it is President Putin or the Premier of China, Situation Room can reach out and get has to be a certified translator from the State Department. Can't just be anybody. Everyone has to be cleared appropriately because you never know what's going to be discussed. It could go from some project to another project, and people have to be familiar with policy issues and what's going on. And they would usually come into the Situation Room, which you can't just walk in. And so we had this select group of translators that we would use for heads of state phone calls. So we got to know them really well. Just of note, Dr. Rice spoke fluent Russian. So it was always easy when she was on a call with the president and she would handle translating duties when talking to the president of Russia or a Russian-speaking country. Is that getting at what you're? Some of these calls could be planned months in advance, and there's also very much of a protocol on different heads of state. Where are they in rank and file when it comes to protocol? That's just the nature of the beast. On 9/11, in crisis, there is a protocol on who's getting to talk to whom first, second. Is the president is it gonna be an actual head of state phone call, or is it gonna be the vice president, or is it gonna be somebody else that's gonna talk to another foreign head of state? So we really had to manage that protocol. I wasn't all that familiar with it. That day, I became very familiar with it because they were happening every minute. The president was picking up the phone or somebody else was picking up the phone talking to a leader. Oh, yeah, that was the other piece of what you asked about. Well, I would like to say they all came through the Situation Room. I would imagine that the president made personal phone calls from the resident. I know that usually the president would call down to the Situation Room if there's somebody he wanted to talk to right away. I remember one phone call that President Clinton made, and it was 3 o'clock in the morning to Tony Blair. And he called, on my desk. I was working a night shift, and it pops up on your phone, residents. You know who that is. And so it was the president saying, hey, still working, and I need to talk to Tony Blair. So that gets the machine moving, got to make some phone calls. President wants to talk to Tony Blair, National Security Advisor needs to come on board. Don't need a translator for that. Need to notify the State Department, notify the ambassador to help out and get someone from the National Security Council country directory to get on board. If they made it in time, great. If not, Situation Room would manage it. But I don't have visibility of he picked up a phone in the resident and made a personal or private phone call. I'd like to think most of them were above board. And if you wanted to be part of the presidential record, Situation Room was the place to do it.
Okay. Thank you again for your talk and your
Sure.
expertise and your service. I had a question that you kind of already answered, so I'll ask a second one. The first one was about how and when and who made the decision that it was safe enough for the president to return to DC. And basically, it was the president's decision. I imagine with a lot of
The Secret Service is ultimately responsible for the president's protection. So they agreed with him. He, made a point. They looked at risk and felt that it was safe for him to come back. But ultimately, it's the Secret Service. Certainly, the president has a voice in that.
Right. So my second question is, there is a bunker room, correct, in the White House? Or maybe you can't answer that. Anyway, assuming there might be one.
So we'd like to talk about safe areas.
Or safe areas.
Yes.
And I guess the bigger question for me is there a point, and in thinking about when the rest of the White House was evacuated and the Situation Room staff decided to stay, is there a point where you could have moved to a safer place within the White House and still been able to function in terms of communications and coordination and all of that? Or
is the Situation Room so uniquely staffed and built so that that can't be moved?
So as I mentioned, it's, 22 years ago. I think a lot of things have changed after 9/11. I know, so I mentioned about the Situation Room being remodeled, $50 million remodel. I'd like to think that that $50 million also includes an alternate location. I'm pretty sure it does. And I do know, I didn't go, I was invited to go to the opening of it. I did not go, but I did communicate with some folks that went, and the director, Army General, mentioned that they used the 9/11 observations and findings. I like to say, I don't come right out and use lessons learned, because you have to learn those lessons, right? So I call them observations and findings. Hopefully, they'll turn into lessons learned down the road. I think many of the things we did, according to the director, they used. So I think evacuation is probably, well honed now. And I think there's many options that will provide redundancy for the Situation Room. I would just, as a side note to that, I mentioned the Pentagon, is really kind of the government backup in crises. Their capability is really robust. But 9/11 was just kind of a bad day, really tragic day for the Pentagon. And so that was not a good choice. I'm confident we learned our lessons, at least with the Situation Room, and from the comments of the director of this new remodel. I think they have that solved.
And our last question, Paul?
Thank you so much. Throughout your career, you've been exposed to an awful lot of information. And I'm just curious, even after being gone for 20 years from your assignment, what % can you not talk about ever?
Sidebar, what can't we talk about ever? There's a lot of stuff. A lot, for those of you who are familiar with, security clearances and need to know, and you're cleared for certain projects, you're cleared for certain locations. When you're dealing with, you're working in the White House, and everything, is president can look at everything. So you have to be cleared for everything. And so there's a lot of stuff out there that still, couldn't talk about even 20 years later. A lot of things in government get declassified. A lot of things don't. And, you see the gambit at a stint on the National Security Council and working in a place like the Situation Room. So I would just tell you, there's a lot of things that can't speak about. And it just goes to show you that, do we overclassify? Do we classify too much? Are some of these things really things that we can't talk about, or 20 years later, there's still classified documents out there? Are they still valid? I think as a government, we probably classify too many things. It doesn't mean, though, that we shouldn't have classified documents, keep things secret, and that as an intelligence professional, I shouldn't still have a responsibility to protect those things that I was charged with to safeguard. And so I can't get real specific. I guess I could get real specific with you, but I just go to tell you, there's a lot.
Thank you.
I want to thank Clark for coming out here. Remember 9/11, we were all watching buildings coming down and crying our eyes out and frightened. And it's so nice to know we have such a good, strong group of Americans that can work through these terrible, terrible times, produce things while we're kind of all freaking out watching TV. So thank you for your service. Thank you for coming out to Symposium. Next week, we are going to talk about another upbeat subject called pandemics. And we hope that you will be here for our next week's seminar. And Clark will be here for a few minutes after if you'd like to come up and address him. Thanks so much, Clark.
Thanks very much. Appreciate it.